Good evening, everybody. I'm Tele-Aviacion, and welcome to This Week in El Salvador. You probably all saw the header which said, El Salvador, 0% inflation. Where this is mostly true, no true conversation could be discussed about deflation or inflation unless we talk about the American dollar. And it's important to understand that since between 1944 and 48, the Bretton Woods Agreement basically made the American dollar the reserve currency for the world, where gold was the reserve currency for the American dollar. And this held true and still continues to this day. As a result, though, it has created some interesting issues with currency devaluation. Certain countries, of course, their currencies have devalued in major ways. Others have managed to keep them at bay. The United States always ends up having probably the least amount of inflation. I guess it really pays to be the reserve currency of the world. But in any case, it's not just the dollar being bad. However, it is debt related. In order to print more dollars, you do have to, you basically have to create more, it's creating more inflation. And every time you do, you create more debt, which prints more and more dollars. But there is a counter-opposing part of this, which is deflationary, and that's called progress. Progress means that there's going to be greater developments, mechanized developments, since the beginning of mass production. Henry Ford kind of coined that phrase in the beginning of the 20th century. We're able to create cars at much less of a price than they normally would have been. At one time, automobiles could only be owned by the very wealthy because each one of them had to be made from scratch and had to be, tailored to the specific individual owning them. But then when mass production came in, the average people were able to get cars. So I can say that was extremely deflationary. And even until this day, mass production has really lowered the costs of so many items that we just take for granted. But it's helped to keep, if there were no more dollar printing, probably these items would be much cheaper than they were 25 years ago. But they've continued to print a lot of money. And there are reasons for that, of course, which we'll go into a little bit later. But also consider other issues. Being the information age, we've also basically caused deflationary action because at one time the amount of labor required to obtain information about entities, organizations, focus groups, this took a lot of time. It took a lot of effort. And now, and of course people had to be paid for that effort. Well, now you can do this through a swipe of the hand. Just go to Google. You can just Siri it through Google, and you can get a lot of the information that would have taken many, many hours, if not days, to obtain at that point. Of course, there's also oil, even though I'm not a big proponent of destroying the environment. But still, if you look at the cost of extracting oil from the ground, it was probably much greater in the beginning than it is now, as greater machinery, technology in developing metals, forging, stamping out these products became far less labor intensive. This, of course, has caused prices to go down. And there's really no shortage of work that people could do, even though there's no question that labor has certainly been affected by this as well. Renewable energy, solar energy, electrical vehicles, all of those things end up ultimately being a little cheaper. I can certainly attest that a Tesla was, probably not the best time since there's a semiconductor shortage, but at one point Teslas were a lot more expensive than they are now because he's able to mass produce them to much greater quantities. The farming process, my goodness, At one time, it wasn't the science that it is now, but over the last 40 years, it's become an incredible science, and they're able to get just the right amount of nitrogen in the soils to feed huge amounts of people in the population using very, very little bit of land compared to what used to be used. This, of course, has confounded people that were absolutely convinced that the human race would have massive food shortages. They have had at times, but in general, because of the advancements in technology, it's actually helped to become cheaper and has helped mankind and has been deflationary. Probably one of the biggest deflationary items would be Moore's Law. Since computers are such a major part of this society, according to Moore's Law, every 18 months the computing power doubles because of semiconductors are able to get smaller and smaller and smaller. As a result, it means you're able to get more information out of computers, and again, that is deflationary, and I consider that to be a healthy inflation. But unfortunately, what's done now is more on the unhealthy side. Probably one of the big things that has caused the problems we have now, well, one of them, I'll get to the biggest later, would be derivatives. Derivatives have created a lot of problems. And I don't want to go into all the elements of derivatives, but one of the big issues is to be able to buy, or I should say sell short an item. When major banking institutions, at the behest of the US Treasury, the Federal Reserve, and even the President of the United States, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, at their behest, those items through our various banking interests can be leveraged, it could be unhealthily done to where they are using derivative action, they are selling short on items and causing artificial pressure to push them down in price. This is unfair and very unhealthy. And unfortunately, the biggest recipients of this unfairness are other countries. Poor countries like in Latin America and Africa have really, really suffered because of this type of action meant to prop the dollar up. Part of the Bretton Woods Agreement, as I had mentioned earlier, was to keep the dollar supreme. So whenever you hear about the dollar being very, very strong, when they say strong, they mean in relation to all the other currencies. It really, really helps if your currency, being the dollar, is the foremost currency, is the currency upon which other currencies are based. Then it is possible to debase these other currencies at your whim. And it is very, very sad that this is one of the things that's happening throughout the world. Not even the euro can withstand, tremendous inflation. But even as high of inflation as we have in the United States, every other country in the world is experiencing even higher inflation. And this isn't fair, but this is how that system works. Not to mention the euro dollar, which happened after we went off the gold reserve in 1971. Then euro dollar created its own different speculative areas, liquidity, and made it possible to artificially create certain types of prices. The petrodollar. Just imagine that every country in the world, after the United States made an agreement in the 70s with Saudi Arabia, that all oil products have to be paid for in the US dollar, which means every country in the world has actually, at a certain exchange rate, exchanged their currency for the US dollar and then buy oil. Well, you can see how that itself would help to lift the US dollar, because then all of a sudden the dollar is king. And this probably was a major item that has caused unhealthy deflation, at least for the dollar, that is. But now I'm going to mention the biggest inflationary thing of them all, and that is the military-industrial complex. Back in 1960, when Eisenhower was, I guess he was making his farewell address to the American public. One of the big items that he mentioned, it was in Oliver Stone's famous film about JFK, but he mentioned the military-industrial complex, and that there's a part of it that if there are no wars, would literally create wars in order to sell their items. And the military-industrial complex is really composed not just of the Pentagon and the military, but it's composed of all of its subcontractors, Raytheon, GE, Lockheed Martin, to name a few. But these are major contractors, and they have a tremendous influence on Congress and the Senate to be able to create more items of mass destruction sold through the military at incredible prices, inflationary prices, and then of course ultimately the American taxpayer has to be able to take care of that bill, which they really are not able to, because it ultimately ends up getting funneled into the national debt. Just consider 2 wars that we were in. One of the biggest wars, which took us off the gold standard, was the Vietnam War, because so many dollars had to be printed to be able to pay for all the items. And finally it just got ridiculous when gold represented less than 5-10% of all the money in existence in the US. So we went off the gold standard, and then we got in a war in Iraq. That was $2 trillion at least. Then in Afghanistan, another $2 trillion. Just imagine what would happen if we hadn't gotten in these wars. And these wars, at least specifically the one in Iraq, was totally developed on false pretenses, on the idea of weapons of mass destruction. I can say we had weapons of mass destruction, but as it turned out, they didn't. So this is highly inflationary. And this really is the crux of the matter, is the military-industrial complex, and its major use and function is to create wars so that we can have a good reason to print more and more money to help not only pay for those wars, but to help make a lot of people rich, and also help to pay for some of the debt on the other money that has been borrowed. So this in itself is highly inflationary. And that leads me to the issue of El Salvador, because that's what this program is about. And consider that there is a type of consent that is being generated in the media that is really making people believe, or trying to make people believe, that El Salvador is an evil state, that they are run by a dictator, and this could not be further from the truth, especially considering the kind of money that he has allowed to be in existence. Now, Bukele and the Bancada Cyan, instead of having Bitcoin, why, they could have made Bukele coin, or some other sort of coin, Shiba Inu or some other thing, but instead they chose Bitcoin, the most deflationary currency and the most advanced currency and sovereign currency known to man. This is what he chose, so that all the people of El Salvador could have this currency. All people could keep this currency on themselves. Don't even have the banks. I'm sure the banks aren't too happy with Bukele, the banks that are in El Salvador right now, but they still serve a valuable purpose. They help exchange. They still, I think, I'm not sure exactly how they're used in El Salvador now, but the dollar I still consider to be a very, very good stable coin, since pretty much all of Bitcoin price is based on where the dollar is in relation to Bitcoin. So I think there's still value in the dollar. But the idea of having Bitcoin as a currency, as a method of saving, when you consider that 70% of the people in El Salvador didn't even have bank accounts at that point. Now at least 70% have the Chivo wallet, which allows them for the first time to have a bank account. Why would a dictatorial society give people such a revolutionary democratic money like Bitcoin? That is something that isn't really addressed in any of these defamatory articles against El Salvador and against the Bancada Cyan and against Bukele. but nonetheless, this is what we're seeing. And so, and I had mentioned last week that there is a law that hopefully, I'm hoping it doesn't pass, but it probably will, called the Accountability for Cryptocurrency in El Salvador Act. This act was co-sponsored by Representative Norma Torres of California. And can you imagine that this country would be so afraid of this little country, El Salvador, that they would have an act specifically to monitor El Salvador? They say part of the act claims that it's to monitor any illegal money going to and from or illegal Bitcoin coming to and from the United States, El Salvador. But really, they're afraid of the destabilization of the American dollar. Now, as I said last week, you can't have it both ways. If the dollar is destabilized by Bitcoin, then that means that the people who have Bitcoin are going to be very wealthy in terms of dollars, including people in El Salvador. Whereas the other big line that is used in all the press is that it's destabilized and Bukele has hurt the people because this currency is very volatile and therefore could go down in price and cause even more problems. Well, either it's going to go down in price or it's going to go up in price. And I know that the US is playing both narratives to the hilt. But in reality, there's just no way that Bitcoin can be kept down. Already, one country now, El Salvador, second country, now recently Africa, a country in Africa, and pretty soon I believe other countries in Latin America are considering it. There's a very good chance by the end of the year there could be at least 4 countries that are utilizing the Bitcoin standard. And of course, that's a little bit scary to a deflationary currency, or I should say inflationary currency, as is the US dollar. So also consider that all of the major news agencies are supported by major producers of war materials, like if you consider Raytheon, like I say, Lockheed Martin. Reuters recently wrote something very, very interesting, saying that due to the surge of murders in El Salvador, Bukele increases the emergency measures for another month. And it's interesting because in the last 6 days, there have been no murders. So when they say surge in murders, again, they're using every opportunity, the press is using every opportunity to really downgrade El Salvador. CNN, one of their major supporters is Raytheon. Also, any of the war correspondents that they use that were former generals, military men, they never disclose what companies they're working for, but most of the time they're working for Raytheon or Lockheed Martin or some major producer of war in some sense. Politico has a tremendous relationship with Lockheed Martin. They're supposed to be a nonpartisan political, giving you good political commentary. GE owns NBC. They make a lot of weapons of mass destruction. And also the New York Times has a tremendous relationship with Raytheon. So this is going on, so it makes sense that all of this generation of consent is being made by the media. Not necessarily consent of war against El Salvador, but certainly consent to perhaps create some sort of a punitive action against them. And this is, and especially in light of today, what governments are doing. Canada recently, stopped the bank accounts for several of the truck drivers, calling the truck drivers type of terrorists. Of course, we know how a lot of the accounts of Russia have been frozen by the United States. Actually, a lot of the accounts of Venezuela have been frozen by the United States over the last 4 years as well. It's not uncommon to do this, but really in reality, none of our currency is really, really safe unless we have it on ourselves. Even then, it's questionable, but at least with Bitcoin, it gives you the opportunity to keep your own coins in your head. And that is a sovereign currency that the world has never seen before now. With another issue, misinformation is about the gang crisis. That has been blown out of proportion. Realize what these gangs are doing, what they have been to El Salvador. They have been a tremendous drain on all of their resources. They have caused tremendous amount of migration of El Salvadorians to the United States for fear of their lives and their families' lives. This has been going on for quite some time. And finally, we have a president and we have a Bancada Cyan, an assembly that has the courage to finally do something about it. I do believe in the end that they will probably, of all people, will probably come up with really good rehabilitative methods to deal with these gang members. But in the meantime, we have to get them off the streets because they are not serving any purpose whatsoever. The only purpose they're doing is creating murder and mayhem, and we do not need that because certainly the world press is taking full advantage of that mayhem. And they want it both ways. First, they complain about the murder rate being so high, and then they complain about the inhumanity of dealing with these murderers. It's just, there's no end to it. But to get off of that, our original subject was 0% inflation for El Salvador. And this is not just achieved. I believe at some point Bitcoin is going to play a big part in that. But in general, the way that the Bancada Cyan and Bukele have handled the situation is really exemplary. Since the crisis happened in Ukraine, they have basically protected the different markets. For instance, fuel being probably the biggest expense there. Any fuel that is imported into the country, if the price has been raised, it's going to be actually, part of that price is going to be covered by a subsidy from the government so that the El Salvadorian people do not have to have expensive fuel, and that their general business occurs between them without such incredible expensive fuel, which is a big issue. Also consider that meat and poultry, those are also protected. Vegetables are protected. Fascinating byproduct of this, and the man is a genius. And the people, the incredibly dedicated people that run the Bancada Cyan are also really doing a great service to humanity. Because figure that it is known through all of South America, I should say, and Latin America, that the prices are lowest. Fuel and food is the lowest price in all South America and Latin America in El Salvador. So that means people are coming in there and buying things from El Salvador. A lot of tourism, more tourism than ever. They're buying so many things, and so as a result, the wholesale items, probably even including fuel, they're able to buy even more of it. And generally when you buy in greater bulk, you're able to get a discount. So they're creating, even helping this anti-inflationary scenario by that action. And so then they're able to continue the trade, they're able to continue selling things within that economy, then they're able to pay more taxes to the government. And so it really goes round and round. Probably really one of the biggest issues is the Chivo wallet, because the Chivo wallet is in essence a state-run bank. Not a mandatory state-run bank. And for instance, you are not required by law to keep your Bitcoin in your Chivo wallet. You can have any wallet you want. You can have a cold wallet. It's perfectly okay. But that is the way that they're running things there, and it's incredibly, it has incredible foresight in it. And we really have to give a country, such a small country with about almost 7 million people, probably 8 million including the diaspora, the amount of people all over Europe and the United States and Canada. But consider what a small country and what tremendous things they can achieve. I really do honestly believe in 10 years, per capita, they may be probably the richest country in the world. So because of this, I want to try to create as much understanding, or help at least in the process, to create more understanding of why we're hearing all of the bad things that we're hearing in the news about El Salvador. And just understand, consider the source. The source may start with a military-industrial complex and then with the US media, but it spreads to all our subordinates. When I read this one article, US Treasury accuses Naib Bukele of paying gangs. That was in early December. I read that article 10 minutes after it came out in the LA Times. Then, about 10 minutes later, the New York Times, and then the Washington Post, and then the Wall Street Journal, and then pretty soon, about 5 hours later, Al Jazeera had it written. The next day, 50 publications had written pretty much the same thing. That is the way that the system works. It generates consent. Consent for what? We don't exactly know, but I know this consent is not for the good of El Salvador. It's more as a sign of fear from the US Treasury, the Federal Reserve, and the military-industrial complex. So with that in mind, I want to thank all of you who have written or commented on my last video. I appreciate you going through this, because I'm a beginner and I hope I become more and more eloquent as time goes on. But again, thank you and good night.